When a billionaire leaned down and kissed his maid in front of a room full of witnesses, everyone thought he'd lost his mind. The cameras caught it all. The flash of emergency lights bouncing off marble floors, her body, limp and pale, barely breathing. And then, without hesitation, he pressed his lips to hers. That single moment didn't just save her life. It unleashed a scandal so explosive, so unbelievable, that within hours the entire world was watching. News anchors dissected it. Social media tore them apart. Prosecutors built a case. But what if I told you that kiss was never supposed to happen? What if everything you think you know about that night is a lie? This is the story of two people who became prisoners of a moment. A story of power, secrets, and a truth so dangerous that someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. Who was the woman he risked everything for? Why would a man worth billions, a man who built an empire from nothing, throw it all away to save someone the world saw as invisible? And what secret were they both hiding? A secret so volatile that it would bring down one of the most powerful men in the country. These are the questions that haunted investigators for months. These are the questions that divided a nation. By the time you reach the end of this story, you'll understand why that kiss changed everything. But I'm warning you now, nothing about this case is what it seems. Alexander Cole didn't inherit his fortune. He clawed his way up from the bottom, from a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Detroit where the heat didn't work, and dinner was whatever his mother could stretch from food stamps. By the time he was 35, he'd built TechVault, a cybersecurity empire that protected half the Fortune 500. He was worth $4 billion. He lived in a glass mansion overlooking the Pacific. He wore custom suits and sat across from presidents. To the world, Alexander Cole was untouchable, but the people who worked for him knew something the cameras didn't catch. He was haunted. There was a coldness in his eyes, a distance that money couldn't fill. He never married, never had children. He worked 16-hour days and slept in his office more nights than he'd admit. And when he walked through his mansion, past the staff who cleaned and cooked and kept his world running, he barely looked at them. Except for one. Her name was Grace. Grace Amara came to America when she was 19, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a desperate hope. She left behind her mother in the Philippines, a woman dying slowly from kidney disease, a woman who needed treatments Grace couldn't afford. So she worked. She cleaned houses in Beverly Hills. She took night shifts at diners. She sent every dollar home. When she finally got the job at Alexander Cole's estate, it felt like a miracle. The pay was good. The work was steady. She kept her head down, smiled when spoken to, and disappeared into the background like all the other staff. But Grace had something most people didn't notice at first. She paid attention. She listened. She saw things. And one night, while cleaning the hallway outside Alexander's private office, she heard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two men, voices low and tense, discussing a deal that involved offshore accounts, falsified audits, and a plan to shift blame onto someone else if things went wrong. She didn't mean to eavesdrop. She froze, her hand still gripping the handle of her cleaning cart, her heart pounding so loud she was sure they'd hear it. When the voices finally faded and the office door opened, she was gone. But the damage was already done. She knew something, and in a world where secrets are currency, knowledge like that can get you killed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It happened 3 weeks later, a Tuesday night in late September. The mansion was hosting a small private gathering, just a handful of Alexander's top executives and their lawyers. Grace was working the event, refilling glasses, clearing plates, moving through the room like a shadow. She felt the eyes on her. One of the executives, a man named Richard Brennan, kept watching her, not with curiosity, with suspicion. Around 10 p.m., Grace excused herself to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking. She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter, the same pitcher the staff used all night. She drank it in 3 long gulps, trying to calm her nerves. That's when it started. A tightness in her chest, a burning sensation crawling up her throat. Her vision blurred. She tried to call out, but her voice came out as a whisper. She stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of glasses. The sound shattered through the quiet mansion like an alarm. Within seconds, staff rushed into the kitchen. Someone screamed. Grace collapsed onto the cold marble floor, her lips turning blue, her body convulsing. Alexander heard the commotion from the dining room. He ran. When he saw her lying there, unconscious, barely breathing, something inside him snapped. He dropped to his knees beside her. Someone yelled to call an ambulance. Another shouted to start CPR. But Alexander didn't wait. He tilted her head back, checked her airway, and pressed his mouth to hers, forcing air into her lungs. Once, twice. Her chest rose and fell weakly. He did it again, and again. Somewhere in the chaos, someone's phone was recording. The footage would later show Alexander Cole, one of the most powerful men in America, desperately trying to save the life of a woman no one even knew by name. It showed the moment his lips touched hers. It showed the panic in his eyes, and it showed the exact second her body finally gasped for air. By morning, the video was everywhere. It had been leaked to a gossip site, then picked up by mainstream news within hours. The headline screamed across every screen in the country, "Billionaire caught kissing his maid in shocking footage." The context didn't matter. The explanation didn't matter. All people saw was a powerful man and a vulnerable woman in a moment that looked, to the untrained eye, like something else entirely. Social media exploded. Activists called it abuse of power. Tabloids spun it into a secret affair. Think pieces were written about class, exploitation, and the invisible women who serve the rich. Grace woke up in a hospital bed 2 days later, weak and confused, with no memory of what happened after she drank that water. When they told her about the video, about the scandal, about the accusations against Alexander, she couldn't breathe. She tried to explain, tried to tell them he saved her life, but no one was listening. Alexander was arrested within the week. The charges were vague but damaging: misconduct, abuse of authority, potential exploitation of an employee. His lawyers fought back hard, but the court of public opinion had already made its verdict. His company's stock dropped 20%. Sponsors pulled out. Protesters gathered outside his mansion with signs that read, "Protect domestic workers, and no one is above the law." And through it all, Alexander said nothing. He refused to defend himself. He refused to throw Grace under the bus. He just sat in his attorney's office, staring out the window, and waited for the truth to catch up. Detective Maria Alvarez didn't believe the headlines. She'd been working sex crimes and exploitation cases for 15 years, and something about this one didn't sit right. The footage showed desperation, not desire. The timeline didn't add up, and when she interviewed the staff, their stories were too careful, too rehearsed. So she dug deeper. She requested Grace's phone records. She pulled security footage from every camera in that mansion. She interviewed every person who was in the house that night, and then she found it. A recording on Grace's phone, a voice memo dated 3 weeks before the incident. It was audio from that night in the hallway, the night she overheard the conversation. The voices were clear. Richard Brennan and another executive discussing a plan to embezzle millions from TechVault's international contracts and frame Alexander if the SEC ever came knocking. Grace had recorded it, not to blackmail anyone, not to sell it, but to protect herself, because she knew that once they realized she'd heard them, she was in danger. Detective Alvarez played the recording in her office 3 times, her jaw tight, her mind racing. Then she looked at the file in front of her. The toxicology report from Grace's hospital admission. It had been flagged as inconclusive, but Alvarez requested a deeper analysis. What came back made her stomach turn. Potassium chloride, a lethal dose, masked in a drink that should have killed Grace within minutes. It didn't, because Alexander Cole's desperate attempt to save her life had kept her heart beating just long enough for the paramedics to arrive. The kiss that the world mocked, the kiss that destroyed his reputation, was the only reason Grace Amara was still alive. When the case finally went to trial, the courtroom was packed. News cameras lined the hallway. Protesters stood on both sides of the street outside. Inside, Alexander sat at the defense table in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. Grace sat in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. The prosecution painted a picture of a man drunk on power, a man who saw his employees as disposable. They showed the video over and over, freezing on the moment his lips touched hers, asking the jury to see what they wanted them to see. But then the defense stood up. They played the audio recording from Grace's phone. The courtroom went silent as Richard Brennan's voice filled the room, cold and calculated, discussing fraud, cover-ups, and contingency plans. They presented the toxicology report. They brought in a cardiologist who explained, in precise medical terms, how mouth-to-mouth resuscitation had kept Grace's heart from stopping entirely, buying her the critical minutes she needed to survive. And then they called Grace to the stand. She walked up slowly, her hands trembling, her voice barely above a whisper at first. The prosecutor asked her to describe her relationship with Alexander Cole. She looked directly at the jury and said, "He saved my life, and the world turned it into a scandal." She explained the night she overheard the conversation, the fear she felt, the decision to record it, not knowing what else to do. She explained waking up in the hospital and learning that the man who saved her was being destroyed for it. Her voice cracked when she said, "I was nobody to him, just another face in his house. But when I was dying on that floor, he didn't hesitate. He didn't think about cameras or consequences. He just tried to save me." The courtroom was silent. Even the prosecutor had no follow-up questions. But the story didn't end there. Because while the trial was unfolding, Detective Alvarez was still digging. She obtained a warrant to search Richard Brennan's office and his home. What she found confirmed everything. Encrypted files detailing the embezzlement scheme. Emails between Brennan and a chemist discussing substances that could cause cardiac arrest without detection. And security footage from the mansion, footage that had been deleted from the main server but recovered from a backup drive. It showed Brennan in the kitchen that night, minutes before Grace entered. It showed him pouring something into the staff water pitcher. It showed him glancing toward the door, checking to make sure no one saw. The footage was played in court the following week. The entire room gasped. Brennan's attorney tried to object, tried to argue chain of custody, but it was too late. The jury had seen enough. It turned out the poison was never meant for Grace. It was meant for Alexander. Brennan knew Alexander sometimes checked in with the kitchen staff late at night, sometimes poured himself a glass of water from that same pitcher. He was trying to kill his boss and make it look like a heart attack. Grace just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the kiss, the moment that destroyed Alexander's reputation and nearly destroyed Grace's life, was the only reason the truth ever came out. Because if she had died that night, the case would have been closed as a tragic accident. No investigation, no questions. Just another invisible woman gone too soon. Richard Brennan was arrested and charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud. He's currently serving 25 years in federal prison. The charges against Alexander Cole were dropped. His name was cleared, but the damage was already done. His company never fully recovered. Investors lost faith. Partnerships dissolved. 6 months after the trial ended, Alexander sold TechVault for a fraction of what it was worth and donated half the proceeds to organizations that protect domestic workers and immigrants. He disappeared from public life. No interviews, no social media, just gone. Grace Amara used the settlement money from the civil case to pay for her mother's medical treatment. Her mother survived. Grace stayed in the U.S. and eventually started a nonprofit called the Invisible Voices Project, advocating for the rights and safety of domestic workers across the country. She and Alexander stayed in touch, not as employer and employee, not as scandal and survivor, just as two people who understood what it was like to be judged by a moment taken out of context. They met once a year for coffee. They never talked about that night. They didn't need to. What happened in that mansion, on that marble floor, in those desperate seconds, bonded them in a way that words could never explain. And though the world moved on to the next scandal, the next headline, the next viral moment, Grace and Alexander carried the weight of that night with them forever. So was Alexander Cole a hero, or just a man trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation? Was Grace a victim, or a survivor who refused to let her story be defined by someone else's crime? The truth is, they were both. They were flawed, complicated, human, and in a world obsessed with quick judgments and viral outrage, their story is a reminder that context matters, that the truth is rarely as simple as a 15-second video clip, that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is save a life even when the whole world is watching and waiting to tear you apart for it. Grace once said in an interview, years after the trial, that she didn't blame the people who judged them. She said, "They didn't know the whole story. None of us ever do. But I hope, when they look back, they remember that a man I barely knew gave me a second chance at life, and that's worth more than any headline." Alexander never gave an interview, but those who know him say he carries a photo in his wallet. Not of his mansion, not of his empire, but of Grace's non-profit ribbon-cutting ceremony, where she stood in front of a crowd of domestic workers and told them, "You are not invisible, your voice matters, and if no one else will fight for you, I will." If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. What would you have done if you were Alexander? Would you have risked everything to save someone the world told you didn't matter? Or would you have stepped back and let someone else take the fall? And what about Grace? If you had overheard that conversation, would you have stayed silent, or would you have recorded it, knowing it could put your life in danger? These aren't easy questions, but they're the ones this story forces us to ask. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if this story made you think differently about the headlines you see every day. Because stories like this, real stories about real people, they don't end when the cameras turn off. They stay with us, they change us, and sometimes, if we're paying attention, they remind us what it means to be human. If you think this story was shocking, wait until you hear the next one. A woman walked into a police station and confessed to a crime that happened 30 years ago. But when detectives investigated, they realized she wasn't the criminal. She was the witness to something far worse, something that powerful people spent decades trying to bury. That story is coming next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Because some secrets don't die. They just wait for the right person to tell them.